I still remember the moment I froze on that river trail. The lantern was swinging inside the shack we had just stepped out of. We hadn't left anything lit. The glass pane glowed faintly, the light catching on the warped boards, the shadows moving as if someone was pacing. The air smelled of wet wood and something metallic, sharp, like old nails left out in the rain. My boots sank into the mud as I tried to steady my breath. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks, until I noticed the rhythm. The lantern wasn't swaying randomly. It moved in slow, deliberate arcs, like someone had pushed it and was still watching it swing. Behind me, Ethan whispered my name, asking if I saw it too. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed tight. Mark muttered that we should just go back in, grab our packs, and pretend we hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't make my legs move, because what chilled me most wasn't the lantern itself. It was the silence that came with it. The rain had stopped tapping on the tin roof. The river, always rushing in the background, sounded like it had been muffled by a heavy hand. For those few long seconds, everything around us felt held still, waiting. And that was the exact moment I knew the shack wasn't abandoned. It had started out like any other hiking trip. The three of us, me, Ethan, and Mark, were trying to squeeze in one last weekend in the woods before the weather really turned. Early autumn, just cool enough that the mornings made your breath fog, but the afternoons were still warm enough to sit by the river without shivering. Ethan had planned the route, tracing the river trail that wound through a state forest none of us had been to before. Supposedly, it was quiet, not as popular as the mountains or the big campgrounds. That was exactly what we wanted. Mark had just gone through a messy breakup. Ethan had been pulling long shifts at the warehouse, and I was buried in office work. The three of us needed a reset, somewhere phones didn't buzz, and the only noise came from water and wind. We met in the grocery store parking lot early Friday morning. I tossed my pack in the trunk of Ethan's old Civic, while he argued with Mark over whether to bring canned chili or instant ramen. Ethan won. He always did. By the time we left town, the car smelled like trail mix, gasoline, and the faint mint gum Ethan was always chewing. The drive itself felt easy, almost comforting. Ethan kept the windows cracked and sang along to old 90s songs on the radio. Mark dozed in the back seat, his head bumping against the window with every curve in the road. I just watched the trees outside grow taller and thicker until cell service disappeared and the towns thinned into patches of farmland and old barns. We parked at the ranger station, signed the little logbook, and started the trail just after noon. The packs sat heavy on our shoulders, but it felt good to stretch out our legs. Ethan cracked jokes, asking which of us would be the first to slip on wet leaves. Mark answered by throwing a pine cone at his back. The plan was simple: hike 5 or 6 miles downriver, set up camp, maybe fish if we had the energy. 2 nights under the trees, then back on Sunday. No deadlines, no stress. Just the three of us, the trail, and the steady sound of water moving beside us. I remember thinking how ordinary it all felt. The kind of trip you expect to remember for the small things, the burned marshmallows, the dumb stories around the fire. But looking back now, every step we took toward that shack was a step deeper into something we never should have found. By late afternoon, the trail began to dip closer to the river. The air grew damp, cool, and carried that steady hiss of water against stone. We were scanning for a flat patch of ground when Ethan stopped ahead of us, pointing with his trekking pole. At first, I thought he was just joking. He had that grin on his face. But then I saw it too. Through a break in the trees, just 20 yards from the water, sat a shack. It leaned heavily to one side, its boards warped and moss climbing up the walls. The chimney looked cracked, like it hadn't held smoke in decades. Windows, if there ever were any, had long since been replaced by nailed planks. "That's actually kind of perfect," Mark said, dropping his pack. "Better than sleeping on the dirt." Ethan laughed, but I noticed he didn't move closer right away. Something about the place pulled at you and pushed you away at the same time. We circled it slowly, crunching over damp leaves. Up close, the shack looked stranger. One door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Someone had carved initials into the frame, overlapping letters, weathered but still sharp in places. A patch of shingles had slid halfway down the roof, exposing black beams beneath. Ethan nudged the door open with his pole. It creaked like a long, slow groan. Inside, dust floated in the weak light. The floor sagged but didn't collapse. There was a stone fireplace in the corner, cold and dark. And then we noticed the details. On a shelf, a single rubber boot sat upright, still wet around the sole. The kind of wet that doesn't come from rain-soaked wood, but from being worn. The air smelled faintly of smoke, not old smoke, but something recent, the ghost of a fire gone cold. Mark said maybe hunters used it, or some drifter passing through. Ethan shrugged, muttering that it was probably fine, but I couldn't stop staring at that boot, glistening as if it had been set down minutes ago. We decided to set up our tents nearby, not inside. Safer that way. By nightfall, a thin mist curled up from the river, and our fire crackled low as we ate canned chili out of dented pots. We laughed, swapped stories, and tried not to look at the shack. Then the sound came. It was faint at first, like branches tapping against the boards. A hollow knock. Once, twice. We froze, spoons halfway to our mouths. Ethan muttered it was probably the wind. Mark agreed, a little too quickly. I told myself the same thing. But even then, I felt it in my chest, that first ripple of unease, the kind that never really leaves once it starts. The knocking stopped that night, but none of us slept well. Every gust of wind through the trees seemed to make the old boards groan, and I swore I heard something moving just beyond the firelight. Ethan tossed and turned in his tent, muttering. Mark finally snapped at him to be quiet. By morning, the rain had started, thin at first, then heavier, soaking the leaves so they slapped wetly under our boots. We debated packing up and heading back, But the trail was already slick, and the river had begun to swell. We decided to wait it out. That meant staying near the shack. Ethan, restless, went to poke around inside. I followed, though I hated the thought. The air inside was colder than the rain, carrying a damp smell that clung to your clothes. The boot was gone. In its place, 3 empty food wrappers lay crumpled in the corner. Brand new, not the faded kind you'd expect. "See?" Ethan said. "Someone's been here. Hunters, squatters, whatever." But the floorboards told a different story. Fresh scratches dragged across them, parallel lines like something heavy had been dragged from one end of the room to the other. My stomach turned. Later, while Mark tried to build a fire out of wet wood, I leaned against the shack's wall to tie my bootlace. My hand brushed something tucked between the boards. It was a scrap of paper, folded tight. The ink was smudged, but the words were clear enough. "Don't stay after dark." I didn't tell the others right away. I just slipped it into my pocket and kept quiet, though the words felt like they burned against my thigh. By afternoon, the rain poured steady. We huddled under a tarp strung between the shack and a tree, listening to the river roar louder than before. Ethan swore he heard breathing inside the shack when he passed the door. Mark cursed at him, said he was imagining things, but I saw the look on his face. Ethan wasn't joking. The 3 of us argued about leaving right then, even if it meant hiking in the dark. Mark wanted to wait until morning, said the trail would be suicide in the rain at night. Ethan wanted out immediately. I kept quiet, feeling the weight of the note in my pocket. The rain pinned us down. Hour by hour, the light drained out of the forest, until only the shack stood against the gray, its door hanging open, waiting. That night, the knocking came again, only louder, and this time it wasn't branches. The 3 of us sat rigid around the dying fire, every muscle tight. The knocking echoed from inside the shack, slow, steady, as if someone was rapping their knuckles against the wall in a rhythm we weren't meant to understand. Ethan whispered, "It's not the wind." His voice cracked on the last word. The rain softened for a moment, enough that we could hear the river again. That's when I noticed it, a faint glow inside the shack, a lantern's glow. We hadn't lit anything. The hair on my arms prickled. I forced myself to look. Through a gap in the boards, I saw the lantern swaying gently, casting long, crooked shadows across the floor. It wasn't just light, it was movement. Someone had set it swinging. "Where's the boot?" Mark asked, suddenly, pointing. I followed his finger. My chest clenched. The single boot was gone. In its place were 3 boots, different sizes, lined neatly by the door as if waiting for us. My mouth went dry. That wasn't there before. We watched in silence as the rocking chair near the fireplace began to move. Slowly at first, then with a steady rhythm, back and forth. It creaked, wood grinding against wood, though no one sat in it. And then came the sound that broke us. Wet footsteps, circling outside in the mud, crunching leaves, deliberate and heavy. One step, then another, dragging slightly as if the boots were waterlogged. They moved around the shack, closer, pausing now and then, like whoever or whatever was out there was listening for us. Ethan bolted upright, whispering furiously that we had to leave. Mark cursed under his breath, grabbed his bag, and I scrambled for mine, nearly tripping over the fire pit. The footsteps quickened, splash, drag, splash, circling closer. We broke into the rain, flashlights jerking wildly through the dark. The trail was nothing but mud, every step sucking at our boots. Branches slapped our faces, water streamed down our backs, but none of it mattered. All I could hear was the echo of those wet steps behind us, perfectly in time with our own. When we slowed, they slowed. When we splashed through a puddle, another splash followed, just a half second too late. It was like something was learning how to walk by listening to us. Mark shouted that we had to cross the river, get to the other bank. We stumbled down the slope, slipping, sliding, until the water surged around our knees. The cold was a knife against my skin. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The shack was gone in the rain, swallowed by fog, but the footsteps kept coming. Into the water, splashes heavy and uneven, but there. We pushed harder, half swimming to the opposite bank, clawing at roots and rocks, until we scrambled up onto wet soil. Ethan collapsed, gasping. Mark tugged at his arm, yelling at him to keep moving. Still, behind us, the water rippled, as if someone else was wading through, slowly, steadily, refusing to be left behind. We didn't stop until the trail widened into gravel, and the faint outline of the ranger station sign appeared through the mist. Dawn was just beginning to bleed pale light into the sky. Only then did the footsteps vanish, leaving nothing but the roar of the river behind us. The ranger on duty listened to our story with a polite but tired expression, the kind reserved for campers who let the woods get into their heads. He wrote a few notes, promised to check the site, and suggested maybe we'd mistaken animal sounds for something else. 2 days later, I called the station, still rattled. The ranger told me they'd gone out. No shack, no boots, no sign of anything man-made along the riverbank at all. For years, I tried to convince myself we'd simply lost our way in the storm, stumbled past some forgotten ruin, let fear do the rest. But every time the rain comes heavy, I find myself back on that trail in my mind, back at the edge of the river, hearing footsteps splash just behind me. The worst part isn't the sound, it's the memory of those boots. 3 of them, lined up by the door, waiting. I never hike by rivers anymore, not because I don't trust the trail, but because water carries sound. And when I hear it rushing, part of me always wonders if, just beneath it, there's still the faint rhythm of someone following. And deep down, I think whatever we escaped that night never really stayed in the shack. It followed us out.
I can still hear her boots on the gravel, quick and light, always a few steps ahead of me. Sarah liked to lead the way, even when she didn't know where we were going. But the moment that sound stopped, that sudden emptiness on the trail, was the moment I knew something was wrong. We had been laughing just seconds before, her voice floating back to me between the trees. Then the bend in the trail came and she disappeared around it. By the time I followed, the path ahead was empty. No boot prints, no movement, just silence, heavy and unnatural. I called her name once, twice, nothing. The forest seemed to swallow my voice whole. Then, faintly, from deeper in the woods, off the trail entirely, I heard it. Not an answer, not words. It was laughter, Sarah's laughter, but it was stretched too far, too thin, as if carried from miles away, yet whispering directly beside my ear. I remember standing there, frozen, staring into the undergrowth. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Because in that moment, I wasn't afraid she was gone. I was afraid she wasn't alone. It was supposed to be simple. Just a weekend hike. Nothing extreme, nothing dangerous. Sarah had found the trail online, bragging about how it was off the beaten path, less crowded than the state parks we usually went to. She liked the quiet, the kind of silence where you could hear your own breath. We left early Saturday morning. I still remember how she teased me at the trailhead, stomping her brand new boots against the gravel. "These better not give me blisters," she laughed, tugging the laces tight. Her pack was too big for her frame, bouncing slightly as she shifted. She always overpacked. Extra snacks, 2 water bottles, even a paperback book stuffed into the side pocket. The forest greeted us with that damp, earthy smell, the ground soft from rain earlier in the week. The sky was overcast but calm, no wind, just a pale gray ceiling that made the greens of the leaves feel darker, heavier. Our boots squelched occasionally in the mud, but otherwise the trail was clear. For the first couple of miles it felt ordinary, almost dull. Sarah hummed little fragments of songs I half recognized. We stopped once to split a granola bar, leaning against a mossy boulder. She joked about how out of shape she felt after too many late nights at work, but truthfully, she seemed to be carrying us both with her energy. There weren't many trail markers, just faded paint on trees here and there. That was part of the appeal, solitude. We hadn't seen another hiker since leaving the parking lot, and by the second hour, the sounds of the road and town were long gone. Just us, the crunch of boots, and the occasional bird darting through the branches. We talked about nothing in particular. Work gossip, weekend plans, whether we'd push for the summit or just camp by the creek. It was the kind of day where everything felt normal, safe. And that's what makes it worse, looking back. Because somewhere between those harmless jokes and the quiet rhythm of our steps, the forest had already started to change. We just didn't notice yet. It started with the trees. At first, I thought the scratches were from bears or maybe someone's pocket knife. Long, vertical gouges running deep into the bark. But they weren't random. They repeated, spaced evenly apart, like a pattern someone was carving on purpose. "Trail maintenance?" I suggested, running my fingers across the grooves. Sarah tilted her head, studying them. "Looks more like tally marks," she said, then grinned to break the tension. Maybe somebody's keeping score out here. I laughed weakly, but the sound died quickly in the still air. We kept walking, but every few minutes another marked tree appeared, always the same shape, the same depth. It wasn't weathering, it wasn't old. About an hour later, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. I didn't notice it right away. Silence slips in slow, the way fog does. But then I realized no birdsong, no rustling, not even wind in the canopy. Just the soft crunch of our boots. Sarah slowed, glancing back at me. "You hear that?" I nodded. Exactly. Nothing. We stood still, straining our ears. That's when it came. The faintest sound, carried through the trees. A voice. It was distant, too muffled to make out words, but definitely human. We hadn't seen anyone else all day. Sarah cupped her hands to her mouth and shouted a casual, "Hello?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, it fell quiet, like it had been waiting for us to notice. We stood there longer than we should have, staring into the undergrowth. Sarah finally shrugged and said maybe it was an echo or a hiker off trail, but her tone lacked conviction. We moved on, but the unease lingered. Every snapped twig behind us made me flinch. Every tall shadow between the trees looked like it might be watching. I told myself not to be dramatic, just woods, just silence, just scratches. But the feeling had taken root, and once it does, it only grows. The trail bent sharply around a cluster of boulders, narrow enough that we had to go single file. Sarah went first, her pack brushing branches as she disappeared from sight. I was only a few steps behind. When I rounded the bend, the path was empty. At first, I thought she'd sped up, that she was playing some dumb game of hide and seek. I quickened my pace, scanning the trail ahead, but there was no movement, no sound. "Sarah!" My voice felt swallowed by the trees. Silence answered. I hurried forward, half running now, until something caught my eye in the dirt. Her water bottle, lying sideways in the middle of the trail, still beading with condensation. She never would have dropped it. She was meticulous about her gear. I picked it up, my chest tightening. "Sarah!" louder this time. Nothing but the muted hiss of my breath in the damp air. Then I saw them. More of those carved markings, not just on one tree, but several, clustered together. They weren't random anymore. They formed crude arrows pointing in different directions, some back toward the trail, some deeper into the woods. My stomach flipped. Whoever had carved them wasn't marking a path. They were playing a game. I pushed off the trail, stumbling over roots, calling her name until my throat burned. The woods pressed close, branches clawing at my jacket. Once I thought I saw movement, a flash of color like her jacket, but when I shoved through, there was nothing, just more gouged bark. Every few minutes I stopped, heart pounding, sure I heard footsteps trailing me, but when I spun around, the path behind was empty. By late afternoon, the light had shifted to that gray prelude of dusk. I knew I should turn back, but the thought of leaving her, alone, maybe injured, maybe worse, gnawed at me. I stood in the clearing, clutching her water bottle, fighting the urge to collapse. The silence thickened, heavy as wool, until the forest seemed to lean in, waiting for my next move. And that's when I realized I wasn't choosing between searching or going back. I was choosing between being hunted alone or hunted with her. By the time darkness fully set in, I was stumbling more than walking, flashlight beam cutting weak
tunnels through the trees. I told myself I'd go just a little further, just until I found some trace of her, anything. And then I did. Her backpack was wedged between two massive roots, half buried in damp leaves. The straps were slick, wet as if they'd just been pulled through water. I dropped to my knees, fumbling to unzip it, desperate for some proof she'd left it behind herself. Inside, everything was neatly packed. Too neat. Sarah never kept her gear that organized. It was as if someone had repacked it after she was gone. I froze. That was when I heard it. Her laugh. It carried through the woods, thin and drawn out, weaving between the trunks, too close, then impossibly far. The sound of Sarah's voice, but stretched, distorted, like someone was wearing it. My flashlight trembled as I swung it around, catching movement between the trees. At first, I thought it was her, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, limbs too narrow, standing too still. The beam landed on its outline just long enough for me to see it wasn't moving naturally, not swaying like a person shifting their weight, but rigid, balanced in a way that made no sense, like a mannequin waiting to be posed. The laugh came again, bubbling from its direction, though its mouth never opened. I staggered back, tripping over the roots, flashlight beams scattering wildly across bark carved with more marks, hundreds of them, too many to count. And through the chaos of my own breathing, I realized the laughter hadn't stopped. It was following me. I ran.
Branches lashed across my face. Thorns snagged my sleeves, but I didn't care. My only thought was get out. The forest blurred past in streaks of black and gray, the carved trees flashing like tally marks, counting down to something I didn't want to know. Behind me, the laughter shifted, closer now, then farther, darting from one side of the trail to the other. Sometimes it sounded like Sarah, breathless and playful. Other times it broke, low and hollow, like something trying too hard to mimic her voice. I didn't dare look back. My flashlight beam caught glimpses, gouges glowing pale in the bark, roots twisting like fingers, flashes of movement just beyond the edge of light. The forest pressed in tight, forcing me faster until my legs ached and my chest heaved. And then, out of nowhere, the ground leveled into gravel. I stumbled forward, almost collapsing as my boots crunched against the solid surface of an old service road. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, flashlight slipping from my hand. The silence after my footsteps stopped was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd made it. Then I heard it. "Hey?" Sarah's voice, soft and sweet, drifting from the tree line. I shut my eyes, hands clamped over my ears. I didn't look back, not once. By the time dawn broke, pale light stretching across the road, the forest behind me was quiet again. Too quiet. Search teams combed the forest for days. Dogs, rangers, volunteers, all of them calling Sarah's name, retracing the trail. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, not even her backpack where I swore I'd seen it. I gave them the water bottle. It was the only proof I had she'd ever been there. They wrote it down, thanked me, but their eyes said something else. People don't just vanish. Not like that. Weeks passed, then months. Her family stopped calling me with updates. The case turned cold, another hiker lost in the woods. But I can't let it go. Because at night, lying awake,
I still hear her boots crunching a few steps ahead of me. I still hear that laugh weaving through the dark, sometimes close, sometimes impossibly far. And the worst part, what keeps me awake most nights, isn't that she vanished. It's that she's still out there. Not Sarah as I knew her, but something wearing her voice, her laugh, her footsteps. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I hear her catching up.
I woke in the middle of the night to silence so heavy it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. My tent walls glowed faintly from the moon above, but it wasn't the light that pulled me from sleep. It was the feeling that something was watching. I unzipped just enough to peek out, and there it was. Against the skyline of the ridge, perfectly framed by the pale glow, stood a figure. Motionless, arms at its sides, head tilted slightly forward, as if staring straight down at me. For a long time, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The stillness of it made my skin crawl more than if it had rushed at me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The figure didn't change, just a black cutout against the horizon. And in that moment, I realized, whatever it was, it had been standing there long enough for me to notice. That trip wasn't supposed to be anything memorable. Just a quick overnight hike to clear my head after a rough week at work. I'd picked a ridge trail about 2 hours outside town. Nothing extreme, a simple climb with a decent view at the top. I packed light, a one-person tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, a couple packets of instant noodles, trail mix, and a single can of beer I'd been saving. Tossed in my headlamp and a paperback too, thinking I'd finally have some time to myself. The hike up was uneventful. The ridge rose slow and steady, lined with dry pines that whispered against one another when the breeze pushed through. Clouds drifted overhead, thin enough to let sunlight scatter through in patches. I remember the crunch of my boots on gravel, steady and grounding, and the faint smell of pine resin that clung to the air. I reached the summit just before dusk, a flat space, open enough for a tent, with the horizon spilling out on both sides. I set up camp quickly, boiled noodles, and sat cross-legged, watching the last streaks of orange fade into gray. It felt peaceful up there, like the ridge was a place cut off from the world below. For the first time in weeks, I let my mind rest. No calls, no deadlines, just me, the stars fighting through a hazy sky, and the faint rustle of dry grass at the edge of the cliff.
When I finally crawled into my tent, I thought the night would be easy, quiet. But quiet in the forest has a way of changing its meaning. The first thing I noticed was the rock pile. It sat right at the edge of the ridge, maybe 20 feet from where I pitched my tent. At first, I thought it was just a cairn, hikers stacking stones to mark the summit. But this wasn't neat. The rocks were jagged, balanced at odd angles, some wet as if they'd been pulled straight from the dirt. I crouched beside it, tracing the edges with my eyes. It didn't look like something built to guide travelers. It looked arranged, too deliberate, but not with care, like someone had piled them up just to say I was here. I told myself other hikers must have left it and pushed the unease down. Still, The image clung to me, and when the wind shifted, it almost sounded like the rocks grinding against each other. That night, after I zipped myself into the tent, I lay awake listening to the forest breathe. Crickets sang faintly, then fell silent. I shifted in my bag, staring at the faint outlines of branches against the nylon walls. Then I heard it. Crunch. Footsteps, slow and steady, circling outside the tent. I held my breath, telling myself it was a deer, or maybe just loose stones tumbling down the slope. But the rhythm was too measured. Step, pause, step. The sound moved around me, brushing close, fading, then returning again. I gripped the zipper, every muscle tight, torn between looking and staying hidden. When the footsteps stopped, the silence was worse. It pressed against the tent walls, waiting for me to react. I never opened the flap. I just lay there, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, wishing for morning.
Sometime past midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my headlamp and unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. Nothing. The ridge stretched empty under the thin moonlight. The rock pile sat where I'd left it, jagged edges glistening faintly with dew. The silence felt heavier now, like the forest was holding itself still. I zipped the tent shut, telling myself I was paranoid. But not long after, I woke again with a jolt. My zipper had been tugged halfway down. My hands shook as I pulled it back up, trying to convince myself it had snagged when I'd closed it earlier. But then I heard the crunch of gravel. Not around the tent this time. Higher, farther up the ridge. I turned on my lamp. Through the thin nylon, the beam cast shadows in every direction. And that's when I saw it. Through the mesh vent above me, a silhouette stood on the ridge, perfectly framed by the skyline, unmoving. Its arms hung stiffly at its sides, its head tilted slightly as though it were listening. My chest locked tight. I snapped the light off instantly. For a long moment, I sat in darkness, convincing myself it was gone. Finally, I flicked the lamp on again. Nothing there. Just the rock pile against the horizon. But the moment I switched it off, the figure returned, standing in the exact same place, still, silent, waiting. I clutched my knees, whispering to myself that I was imagining it. That's when I heard another sound, soft, low, and impossible. My own whisper, repeated back to me.
The sound chilled me deeper than the sight of the figure. My own words whispered back, only a beat slower. Not an echo, an imitation. I froze, afraid even to breathe. Through the mesh, the figure remained fixed at the rock pile. The moonlight carved its shape sharp against the sky, too still to be human. I whispered again, just to test it, just one word. Hello? The answer came back, the same word, stretched and hushed, sliding through the night like air leaking from a cracked pipe. My stomach turned. I could feel the voice press against me, too close, though the figure hadn't moved an inch. Then, as I stared, the head tilted further, unnaturally far, like a branch bending under too much weight. It leaned toward me, as if listening harder, as if savoring the sound of my fear. My flashlight trembled in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I couldn't bear to see if it was still there in the light, or closer. The ridge felt alive, the rocks beneath me humming with tension. I knew if I stayed another minute, I'd hear not just my whisper repeated back, but my scream. I couldn't stay.
I shoved my gear into the pack with shaking hands, straps dangling loose, stove and cup clattering as I fumbled in the dark. Every sound I made seemed to echo too loudly, as though the ridge itself were amplifying my panic. When I finally unzipped the tent and bolted out, the air hit me like ice. My headlamp beam wavered across the rock pile. Empty. Just jagged stones glistening in the moonlight. I didn't trust it. I didn't look twice. I shouldered the pack and stumbled onto the trail, half running, half sliding down the loose gravel. Behind me, the ridge groaned. Stones tumbled, sharp and deliberate, as if something had stepped down from the pile and was following. I pushed harder, lungs burning, legs screaming, but I didn't dare stop. Each time my boots struck the dirt, I heard another crunch behind me, perfectly in step, only heavier. By the time the trail curved into the forest and the skyline disappeared behind branches, I was gasping so hard I thought my chest would split. The sound of tumbling rocks faded, swallowed by the trees. But I didn't slow down, not until the first pale wash of dawn lit the trail. By sunrise, I stumbled back to the trailhead. Mud streaked up my legs, gear half hanging from my pack. A ranger's truck sat in the lot, empty. I almost pounded on the door just to have someone hear me, but I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd seen. Later, when I checked the logbook, my name was the only one signed in for that weekend. No hikers ahead of me, none behind. No one should have been on that ridge. I told myself it must have been exhaustion, a trick of light and nerves. But even now, years later, I don't believe that. The memory is too sharp. The figure's stillness, the tilt of its head, the whisper that wasn't mine. I still hike, but never overnight. As soon as the sun dips, I'm off the trail, because when the sky turns dark and the ridgeline cuts black against it, I can't stop myself from looking. And every skyline, no matter where I am, reminds me of that figure, waiting for me to notice it again.
The lake wasn't supposed to be there. We had studied the maps, checked the ranger station, even marked the route on Alex's brand new GPS watch. There was no mention of it. No blue smudge on the topographic lines, no trail signs pointing the way. And yet, after hours of hiking through the forest, we stepped into a clearing, and there it was. A wide, black surface, stretching farther than the moonlight could reach, still as glass, swallowing the trees in its reflection. Dana muttered that maybe we'd misread the map. Alex frowned at his watch, shaking it as if the screen were broken. "It's not here," he kept saying. "There's nothing here." I wanted to believe him,
but the water lapped faintly at the shore, cold and real, dampening my boots when I got too close. The air carried no sound of frogs or insects, just the heavy silence of something waiting. That night, when we finally left in panic, soaked and trembling, I forced myself to look back one last time. The clearing was empty. The lake was gone. There were 3 of us on that trip, me, Alex, and Dana. We weren't experienced backpackers, but we weren't amateurs either. Enough weekend hikes under our belts to know how to pack light, how to read a trail map, when to turn back. This trip was supposed to be just another easy loop, 12 miles total, 1 night out, camp by a stream, then home by Sunday evening.
Alex had been the one to suggest it. He just bought a new GPS watch and wanted to field test it, as he kept saying. He was the kind of guy who loved gear, always bragging about new boots or water filters or whatever gadget he'd convinced himself was essential. Dana, on the other hand, overpacked everything. By the time we left the car, her pack rattled with extra trail mix, 2 extra jackets, and even a metal coffee press. She claimed she liked being prepared. We started late in the morning, under a sky washed pale gray. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of wet leaves from rain earlier in the week. Our boots squelched in soft patches of mud, but otherwise the trail was clear, weaving between tall pines and the occasional stretch of fern. Alex led the way, checking his watch every few minutes and calling out our pace like he was our coach. Dana trailed behind, humming softly, her pack bouncing with each step. I walked in the middle, listening to their back and forth. Alex teasing Dana about packing half her kitchen, Dana mocking him for staring at his wrist every 30 seconds. We stopped for lunch on a fallen log, jerky, trail mix, and Dana's emergency chocolate bars. We laughed, traded stories, and for a while it felt like any other trip. Normal. Safe. The plan was simple. Follow the marked trail until late afternoon, set up camp near the stream Alex had circled on the map, then head out the next morning. Nothing complicated. Nothing unknown. At least, that's what we thought. Because a few hours later, the trail began to stretch longer than it should have, and the first hints crept in that something wasn't right. It started small. The trail felt longer. According to the map, we should have reached the stream by mid-afternoon, but the sun was already sinking lower and we hadn't even heard water yet. The painted blazes on the trees, once bright, had faded to pale smears, some half hidden under moss. Could be we missed a junction, Alex muttered, staring at his GPS. The screen showed our position blinking on the trail, except the distance didn't add up. His watch insisted we were moving faster than we knew we were.
Dana sighed and kicked at the dirt. If we don't find water soon, we're just setting camp in mud. Then, faintly, we heard it. Running water. Relieved, we hurried toward the sound, bushwhacking through brush when the trail didn't quite lead us there. But instead of a narrow stream, we stepped into a clearing, wide, open, wrong. A lake spread before us, still and black as glass. No ripples, no waves, just a perfect mirror of the darkening sky. It wasn't on the map. Alex checked twice, scrolling through screens on his watch, shaking it like it had betrayed him. "This shouldn't be here," he whispered. We stood at the shore, waiting for some sign of life. Frogs, dragonflies, even mosquitoes. Nothing. The silence pressed in so heavy that I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Dana tossed a pebble into the water. It plunked down and vanished. No splash, no rings spreading outward. The surface simply swallowed it whole, as if it had never existed. I wanted to leave then,
to turn back, even if it meant retracing every step in the dark. But the forest was already folding in around us, shadows long and thick, the air cooling fast. Tired and uneasy, we made the mistake of staying. We set up camp on a narrow strip of ground near the shore, though none of us said out loud how wrong it felt. Dana busied herself boiling water for noodles, Alex kept fiddling with his GPS, and I gathered damp branches for a fire that never seemed to catch. The lake stayed perfectly still. Not a single ripple crossed its surface, even as wind rustled the trees around us. It reflected everything: the branches, the stars, the pale slice of moon, like a sheet of polished stone. "Creepy," Dana muttered as she stirred her pot. "It doesn't even smell like a lake. No algae, no mud, nothing." Alex didn't respond. He just stared at his watch, jaw tight. "Every direction I map loops back here. Doesn't make sense. It's like..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Like the trail is wrong." That night, the silence deepened. No insects, no frogs, just the faint crackle of our fire. Then came the splash. We all froze. Another splash, closer, like someone wading through shallow water. Alex grabbed his flashlight, aiming across the lake. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, something pale, upright, halfway across. But when the beam settled, the surface was blank. Dana laughed nervously. "Probably a deer." But deer don't wade halfway into black water without a sound. When Alex turned the light off, I saw it. 3 separate ripples rolling outward from the shore. None of us had touched the water. We stayed awake after that, whispering arguments about leaving immediately or waiting until dawn. At some point, I noticed Alex's GPS screen flickering. The map twisted, red lines curling in circles, always leading back to the same point, the lake. By then, I was too afraid to admit what I was thinking, that the lake wasn't just on the map, it was the map, and it wanted us stuck there. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. Not the careful shuffle of boots on dirt, but the slick slosh of water being parted. I shot up, heart racing. Alex's tent was empty. His pack was gone. "Alex?" I hissed, but Dana was already scrambling out of her bag. We ran to the shore together, flashlights cutting across the lake.
His backpack sat upright in the mud, straps dripping, as if it had just been set there. No sign of him. Dana whispered, uneasy, "He wouldn't just go in, would he?" Before I could answer, the surface rippled, fast, unnatural, as if something had dived under and was circling. We both stumbled back, beams trembling. That's when I looked down. The lake reflected us, but wrong. Our shadows leaned forward, closer than we stood. Behind our reflections, other shapes stood watching. Tall, thin, their outlines blurred, but their faces, if you could call them faces, were fixed directly on us. I jerked my head up. Nothing was behind us on the shore, but in the water, the figures remained. And then, our reflections smiled. We hadn't moved. Dana screamed, and that broke whatever trance held us. We grabbed our half-packed gear and bolted into the trees, branches snapping against our faces as we ran blindly uphill. Behind us, the lake stirred, not rippling gently, but churning, like something massive was breaking the surface. I didn't look back. Every instinct screamed that if I did, I wouldn't come away whole. We ran until our legs shook, but every path we chose bent back toward the water. The trees opened once, and there it was again, black, still, waiting. Dana sobbed, her voice cracking. "It's following us."
I forced us uphill, ignoring compass, ignoring Alex's useless GPS still clutched in Dana's hand. We climbed in desperation, tearing through brush until my chest burned and my lungs rattled. And then, suddenly, the ground leveled. The air changed. We burst out onto a familiar trail, one we recognized from hours earlier. The lake was gone. No clearing, no water, just forest stretching endlessly in every direction. Dawn broke moments later, pale and fragile, painting the trees in washed-out gold. Dana collapsed against a stump, gasping. I stood there shaking, terrified of what sunrise might reveal. But there was nothing. No sign we'd ever been near a lake at all. When we staggered back to the ranger station that morning, mud-caked and hollow-eyed, they asked the usual questions: route, supplies, companions. We told them about Alex, about the lake. The ranger frowned and shook his head. There's no body of water on that side of the range. Closest lake's 15 miles in the opposite direction. Search teams went out for days. They found no footprints, no campsite, no trace of Alex. Officially, he was marked as another lost hiker, disappeared into the woods. But I know better. I saw what the water showed us. I saw our reflections smile when we didn't. Dana doesn't hike anymore. I still go sometimes, but never in that forest. Never near unmarked trails. And when I look at maps, I can't stop staring at the blank spaces, those stretches of green where nothing is drawn. Because if a lake can appear where it shouldn't, it can open again. And next time, maybe it won't let me leave.
I remember stopping at the ridge, just as the last of the lights slipped away. The valley below was already dark, swallowed in shadow, except for the glow. A cluster of tents sat down there, faintly lit from within, their shapes pale and hunched against the grass. At first I thought it was comforting, proof that I wasn't the only one out in that wilderness. But then I remembered what the ranger had told me that morning. No one else had signed in. The lights inside flickered softly, like candles behind thin fabric. Yet there was no smoke, no fire, no sound of laughter or cooking, just silent, waiting tents. And in that stillness, staring down at that valley, a thought crept in that I couldn't shake. Those people weren't camping, they were waiting. I'd been hiking solo that weekend, nothing ambitious, just a loop that followed a ridge, dropped into a valley, then cut back to the ranger road by Sunday afternoon. A simple overnight trip to shake off the weight of the week. The plan was to camp near a river crossing. I'd circled it on the map. Even asked the ranger if the water was low enough this time of year. He'd nodded, said it was fine, and mentioned no one else had checked in for that section. That was part of why I'd chosen it. Solitude. By late afternoon, I was tired but in good spirits. The kind of bone-deep fatigue that makes every snack taste better, and every sip of water feel earned. The trail wound steadily downward, gravel crunching under my boots, air cooling as shadows stretched long through the trees. I was picturing the river ahead when I came to the ridge and stopped. The valley spread out below me, open grassland cupped by low hills, and right in the middle, a handful of tents glowed faintly, pale yellow shapes against the dark. They looked too still, too perfect, like a campsite set up not for comfort, but for show. And in that moment, I knew my night was not going to go the way I planned.
By the time I reached the valley floor, dusk had thickened into full dark. My headlamp beam cut a narrow cone ahead of me, but I barely needed it. The tents glowed faintly on their own. Up close, they looked wrong. The fabric sagged, weather-stained and rotting in places, like they'd been sitting here for years. Yet light seeped steadily through the seams, soft and pale, pulsing faintly as though someone inside was shifting a lantern back and forth. I stood just outside the circle of them, waiting for voices, for the shuffle of boots, for anything that would tell me this was just another group of hikers. But the air was silent. No fire crackling, no laughter, not even the faint hum of insects. Finally, I edged closer. 1/10 zipper was halfway undone, flapping slightly in the cool breeze. I leaned down, headlamp sweeping across the opening. Inside lay 2 sleeping bags, damp and mildewed, a few tin cups scattered in the dirt, all coated with mold. No packs, no people. I jerked back, heart hammering, because as I shone my light across the other tents, shadows rippled against the thin walls, shadows of figures moving slowly inside. And yet every tent was empty. I circled slowly, breath shallow, headlamp trembling in my grip. The closer I looked, the stranger it became. Each tent sagged with age, fabric torn, seams frayed, yet their walls pulsed with movement, like someone was pacing inside. A sound drifted through the valley then, low, muffled, impossible to pin down. At first I thought it was the wind whistling through the grass, but no. The noise rose and fell like voices, soft and overlapping, as if dozens of people were murmuring just beneath the surface of the air. I crouched near the half-open tent again, trying to listen. My own reflection stared back at me in a puddle pooled at the entrance. For a second, I thought I saw another face behind mine, gray, blurred, watching through the water. I jerked my head up. Nothing. Just the sagging tents, silent again.
Then, all at once, the murmuring swelled, louder, closer, pressing in from every direction. Shadows darted across the tent walls in unison, long and bent like limbs moving at odd angles. The zipper on the nearest flap twitched, stopped, then began to slide slowly downward on its own. One by one, the others followed, each tent opening itself, each shadow freezing, as though waiting for me to see what was about to come out. My light swept wildly across the tents as the zippers inched lower, teeth parting with a slow, deliberate rasp. I stumbled backward, my boots sinking into the damp grass. The shadows inside the tents shifted once more, then froze completely, like silhouettes caught mid-motion. The murmuring stopped. For a heartbeat, the entire valley held its breath. The only sound was the quick, ragged pull of my own lungs. Then, from deep inside the closest tent, something pressed outward. Not a hand, not a face, just a shape,
straining against the thin fabric until it bulged, stretching toward me. The seams groaned, threads snapping one by one. I snapped the flashlight game on it, and every single shadow across every tent turned their heads in unison. Not the tents themselves, the shadows. They had been waiting for me to shine the light, and now they knew exactly where I stood.
I didn't wait to see what came next. I spun and bolted, my pack half unzipped, gear spilling behind me. The grass tore at my legs as I scrambled uphill, the beam of my headlamp jerking wildly with each panicked step. Behind me, fabric ripped, long, tearing sounds as though the tents were collapsing all at once. Something heavy dragged across the ground, low and fast, as if crawling out from the wreckage. I forced myself not to look back, not even once. Every instinct screamed that if I did, I'd see them crawling after me on all fours, pale shapes spilling from shredded canvas. The murmurs rose into a single sound then. Not words, not voices, but a chorus of breath. Cold, wet, and close. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs buckled beneath me, and even then I kept clawing at the dirt, desperate to climb higher, away from that valley. Only when the hill finally leveled into the dark forest did the sounds fade. The breath, the tearing, the dragging, all of it swallowed by silence. At first light, I forced myself back toward the ridge, half convinced I'd see the shredded remains of canvas strewn across the grass. But the valley was empty. No tents, no gear, no footprints. Just flat, dew-soaked ground, as if nothing had ever been there at all. I left, without looking back again, stumbling through the forest until I reached the ranger road. When I told them what I'd seen, they gave me a puzzled look, said no groups had signed in that weekend. No one. I don't camp in valleys anymore. I stick to ridges, high ground, places where I can see everything around me. Because I know what I saw that night. Canvas glowing, zippers sliding open, shadows waiting. And I know those tents are still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next hiker to step into the dark.